There is a name carried by millions of people across the world who believe it connects them, in an unbroken line, to a longship, a raid, a warrior standing at the prow of a Norse ship 1,000 years ago. For generations, that belief felt solid. Then geneticists opened the genome, and the line was not nearly as clean as anyone expected. The story seemed complete. That was the problem. Names like Ragnarsson, Bjornsson, Halvorsson, Eriksson, Thorson, and a dozen others have carried Viking mystique for centuries, evoking axes and longships, raids on distant coastlines, gods carved into wooden prows. Millions of people across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and the diaspora beyond have grown up believing these names are a genetic inheritance from that age, a direct thread back to the warriors of the North. But when researchers actually compared the DNA beneath these surnames to the ancient genomes of real Viking Age skeletons, what they found did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it, and revealed something about Viking identity itself that even historians had underestimated. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe, because the deeper history of the North turned out to be far stranger than the myth. For centuries, the story of the Vikings has followed a fairly consistent shape. Between roughly 793 and 1066 CE, seafaring raiders and traders from what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark launched voyages across the North Atlantic and beyond, raiding monasteries in Britain and Ireland, trading along Russian river systems, settling in Iceland, Greenland, and eventually reaching the shores of North America. Surnames referencing this era, patronymics built on Norse first names, often ending in son or sen, meaning son of, were assumed by many descendants to be a kind of genetic fingerprint. If your name was Eriksson, the logic went, somewhere back there stood an actual Eric, and behind him, a long, mostly unbroken Norse bloodline. It was a clean story. Ethnic Norse warriors, expanding outward, their names and their genes traveling together across the sea. But historians and archaeologists had already noticed something that did not sit comfortably inside that clean narrative. The Viking world, even at its height, was never ethnically uniform. Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia contained grave goods, styles, and even some skeletal evidence suggesting contact, and sometimes cohabitation, with peoples from the British Isles, the Baltic, Slavic territories, and further east. Icelandic sagas themselves, often treated as pure Norse heroic literature, describe Norse men bringing wives and captives from Ireland and Scotland into the earliest generations of Icelandic settlement. The names may have been Norse. The households sometimes were not. This is the first crack. A culture whose language, mythology, and naming customs were unmistakably Norse, but whose actual population, even in its own era, may have been more genetically mixed than the saga's heroic framing suggested. This is where ancient DNA entered the investigation, not as a side note, but as the method that finally allowed researchers to test the sagas against the skeletons themselves. A landmark ancient genomics study published in Nature in 2020, led by researchers including Esk Willerslev, sequenced the genomes of more than 400 Viking Age individuals recovered from archaeological sites spanning Scandinavia, the British Isles, Russia, and the North Atlantic. This was, at the time, one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever conducted on a single historical population, and it allowed scientists to compare Viking Age genomes directly against each other, against earlier Scandinavian populations, and against neighboring regions, rather than relying only on modern DNA and its long, blurred aftermath of centuries of subsequent migration. What the genome revealed did not simply confirm the old picture of Vikings as a genetically unified Scandinavian people expanding outward. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The study found that Viking Age Scandinavia itself was not a genetically homogeneous population. Researchers identified substantial gene flow into Scandinavia from the British Isles, Southern Europe, and the East Baltic region during the Viking Age itself, meaning that by the time raiding and settlement voyages were underway, many of the people we call Vikings already carried mixed ancestry, sometimes significant amounts of it. Some individuals buried with full Norse Viking grave goods, in Viking-style burials on Scandinavian soil, carried genetic ancestry that was largely non-Scandinavian, a finding the researchers themselves described as evidence that Viking identity, even at the time, was not strictly a matter of biological descent. The story did not collapse. It widened. Several explanatory threads emerged from this widening picture, and researchers have had to weigh them carefully rather than settling on one simple answer. The first is large-scale admixture during the Viking Age itself. Captives, traders, and settlers from Britain, Ireland, the Baltic, and the Slavic world being absorbed into Scandinavian communities across generations, their descendants going on to carry entirely Norse names and entirely Norse cultural identity despite mixed ancestry. The second is cultural identity operating independently of bloodline. The idea that Viking was, in a meaningful sense, more of an occupation and cultural affiliation than an ethnicity. Someone could become part of a raiding crew, a trading network, or a settled Norse community, adopt its language, its gods, its names, and be considered fully part of that world regardless of where their grandparents had been born. The third is regional variation within Scandinavia itself, meaning that Norse ancestry was never a single genetic signature to begin with, but a patchwork already shaped by earlier Bronze Age and Iron Age population movements across Northern Europe, onto which the Viking Age admixture was simply the latest layer. The 2020 Nature study became the landmark reference point precisely because of its scale and its use of true ancient DNA rather than modern comparative data alone. It allowed researchers, for the first time, to see Viking genetic diversity as it actually existed in that era, not filtered through 1,000 years of subsequent European population movement, war, and migration that make modern Scandinavian DNA a much blurrier mirror of the Viking Age itself. And here is the twist that reframes what a Viking surname can and cannot tell you. Not a single bloodline. Not even a single point of origin. The genome revealed that some of the most iconic Viking Age burial sites, including sites in Britain long assumed to represent local populations conquered by outside Norse raiders, contained individuals who were genetically indistinguishable from local British populations, despite Norse-style graves, weapons, and burial customs. In other words, some Viking raiders, identified purely by archaeology and material culture, were, genetically, local people who had adopted Norse identity, not invaders who had arrived from Scandinavia at all. Meanwhile, some individuals in Scandinavia carried significant ancestry from the British Isles or the Baltic while still being buried, culturally, as fully Norse. The surprise was not that the Viking world contained mixing. Historians expected that. The surprise was how early it began, how deep it ran, and how thoroughly cultural identity had already decoupled from genetic origin, even within the Viking Age itself, centuries before any of these communities began producing the surnames we recognize today. This matters for far more than genealogy hobbyists tracing a name back to a longship. It reveals something true about nearly every population claiming a heroic, singular origin. The Viking world was not a fortress of Norse purity gradually diluted by later history. It was, from its very beginning, a networked, mobile, absorptive culture, one where identity was built through language, loyalty, craft, and belief as much as through bloodline. A Viking surname does not certify unbroken Scandinavian descent any more than a Roman-sounding name certifies descent from the city of Rome itself. It certifies inheritance of a name, a story, a culture chosen and carried forward, sitting on top of ancestry that may trace to a dozen different coastlines. Picture the western coast of Norway in late autumn, fjord water black and still beneath cliffs, the light failing early, wood smoke rising from turf-roofed halls. Longships rest pulled up on gravel beaches, their carved prows silent until spring. Inside those halls, in the 9th and 10th centuries, families gathered who spoke the same Norse tongue and honored the same gods regardless of whether their mother had been born on that coast, or brought from Ireland, or descended from Baltic traders 3 generations back. The wind off that water did not distinguish between them. Neither, it turns out, did the culture that shaped what it meant to be Norse. If this kind of layered, evidence-driven history moves you, subscribe, because the further science pushes into ancient genomes, the more clearly we see that almost no ancestral story was ever as simple as the name alone suggests. In the end, the DNA did not strip the Viking legacy away from the millions who carry these names today. It did something more interesting. It revealed that Viking identity was never a closed genetic club to begin with, that the raiders, traders, and settlers who built that world were absorbing outsiders and reshaping their own community from the very first generations, long before any saga was written down to make the story sound cleaner than it ever actually was. The name may still connect you to that world, not necessarily through an unbroken bloodline back to a single Norse ancestor, but through a culture that was always, even at its height, built from more places, more peoples, and more meetings than the legend allowed. The longship carried more than warriors. It carried a history still being uncovered, one genome at a time.